People ask me sometimes why I've never left Hatchett's Diner. 31 years I've worked this counter. My feet hurt, the pay is not remarkable, and the coffee machine has needed replacing since the second Clinton administration. But I stay, and if you ever saw what I saw on that Thursday in October, you wouldn't need to ask again. His name was Earl. He was 92 years old, Korean War, 2nd Infantry Division. He had a pin on the lapel of his old sport coat, a small silver thing shaped like a cross with a wreath, and he wore it every single Thursday when he came in for his slice of apple pie and his decaf. He always sat at the near end of the counter, always on the same stool, and he always left me the same tip, $2 and a word of thanks that he meant like a prayer. He was the kind of man who made you feel for a moment like goodness was not complicated. I had known Earl for 11 years by then. I knew that his wife had passed in the spring of 2009, and that he had been eating his Thursday pie alone ever since it. I knew that his son lived out in Oregon and called on holidays and not much more. I knew that his hands shook when he poured his creamer, and that he never once remarked on it and never once asked for help. He was proud in the quiet way that men of his generation were proud. Not boastful, not bitter, just upright. That Thursday the diner was about half full. A table of 4 young men had pushed 2 of our small tables together near the window. They were loud from the moment they came in, and they got louder as the afternoon wore on. Somewhere around the second cup of coffee they noticed Earl. It started small. A comment about how long it took him to lower himself onto his stool. A remark about the pin on his lapel that was half a question and half a sneer. I stepped over and gave them a look that I have given men in this diner for 3 decades, the look that says, "This will stop now." They quieted for about 4 minutes. Then one of them, the one with the red cap, leaned over toward his friends and said something that made them all laugh. Not a word of it was for Earl directly, but the volume was calibrated precisely so that he could hear it. And when I looked at Earl's face, I saw that he had heard every syllable. He set down his fork. He did not say anything. He just folded his hands on the counter in front of him the way a man folds his hands in a pew, and he looked straight ahead at the pie case, and he did not move. I have seen a lot of things in 31 years behind this counter. I have seen grown men cry. I have seen a woman pull off her engagement ring and set it in the sugar dish and walk out the door. I have seen kindness I could not have invented and cruelty I wish I could forget. But the image of Earl sitting there with his hands folded, working very hard at the simple dignity of finishing his pie while 4 young men laughed at him. That one stays with me the way certain things do, like a notch cut into a beam. I had not noticed the man in the corner booth until he stood up. He had been there since before Earl arrived. He was big, not loud big, but the kind of big that fills a room without announcing itself. He had a leather vest with patches I didn't recognize, heavy forearms stacked with ink, a gray beard close cut, and the particular stillness of a man who has learned to be patient with the world. He had been eating alone and reading nothing and looking at no one, but he had been watching. When the table by the window laughed that second time, the man in the corner booth set down his coffee cup and he stood up. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. He crossed the diner in a way that was almost gentle, the way a river is gentle right up until it isn't, and he stopped between Earl's stool and the table of 4. He looked at the young men for a moment without expression. Then he picked up Earl's hat. They had somehow gotten Earl's hat. I had not even seen how, and one of them had been spinning it on his finger, and he held it quietly for a moment. Then he turned and set it on Earl's head himself, carefully, the way you'd set a crown. And he said 7 words, low enough that the table could hear them and no one else could. I don't know exactly what those 7 words were. I have thought about it since then, and I have my guesses. But whatever they were, the young men at that table did not say a single thing after. They sat there with that particular quality of stillness that is not calm. It is the stillness of people who have just understood something about the situation they are in. The big man turned back to Earl. He put out his hand. Earl looked at it for just a second, and then he took it, and the man helped him down off the stool the way you'd help your father. He picked up Earl's check. I tried to wave it off, and he shook his head once. And he paid it at the register, and then he walked Earl out the front door. I watched through the glass. The big man walked Earl to his truck, an old white Ford so familiar to me I could have drawn it from memory. They stood by the driver's side door for a moment. I couldn't hear anything, of course. I could only see the 2 of them standing in the October light. Earl's hand still in the big man's, both of them looking at each other the way men look at each other, when there is nothing more that needs to be said. Then Earl got in, and the big man closed the door gently, and he stepped back, and he watched the truck until it pulled out of the lot and onto the county road and disappeared past the tree line. That was the goodbye. At the time, I did not know it was anything more than that. The young men left 10 minutes later. They did not look at me on the way out. 40 minutes after Earl's truck turned off the county road, I heard it. I have heard motorcycles my whole life, and I know the sound of 1 or 2 or 5. This was not that. This was a sound that started as a rumble at the edge of hearing and built, steadily, the way a storm builds, until the windows of the diner were carrying a faint vibration that had nothing to do with the wind. I walked to the window. They were coming down Route 11 in a long column, 2 by 2, the way I'd seen footage of military processions, each pair precisely spaced from the one ahead. Leather vests, patches, the glint of chrome in the afternoon light. They turned into Hatchett's lot in that same orderly column, and they filled it, row by row, in under 4 minutes. When they were done, there was no more room in the lot, and a second column had lined the shoulder of the road in both directions. 97 motorcycles. I know the count because I stood at that window, and I counted them one by one. The man from the corner booth was standing at the edge of the lot when they arrived. He had not gone anywhere. He had simply waited, and now he walked down the row as the engines shut off one after another. Not running, exactly, just moving, and the riders nodded to him as he passed. Not a word spoken that I could hear. The young men's car was still in the lot. I watched the riders park and sit and wait, and I thought about going out, and then I thought better of it. The 4 young men came out of the diner, through the side door, about 5 minutes later. They crossed the lot to their car, in a silence I could see from inside the glass, even if I couldn't hear it. That particular walk of men who are, moving at normal speed but very, very carefully. They got in. They drove out onto Route 11. The column on the shoulder did not move or speak or gesture. They just watched. That was all. There was no confrontation I witnessed. There was no scene. There was only the weight of 97 men, sitting on their motorcycles in the afternoon light, and the unmistakable understanding that some things are protected in this world by people you would not expect. After the car was gone, the man from the corner booth came back inside. He sat down at his booth and he finished his coffee. I refilled his cup without being asked, and I could not think of a single thing to say, so I said thank you. He nodded. He left $12 on a $6 check, which is not the largest tip I have ever received, but is the one I have thought about most. What happened after that is the part I tell when people ask me why I stay. The following Thursday, Earl came in for his pie, and in the booth in the corner where the big man had sat, there were 2 riders. Not the same man, 2 others, vests and patches, sitting quietly with their coffee. Earl nodded at them when he came in. They nodded back. He sat at his stool and had his pie and left his $2 tip. The Thursday after that, there were 3. It went on that way for 2 years. Sometimes 2 riders, sometimes 4, sometimes more. Different faces. The whole chapter rotated through, it seemed, week by week, as though they had worked out a schedule. They never crowded Earl, never made a production of it. They had their coffee and their pie, and they were simply there. Earl, for his part, seemed to understand this arrangement completely, and to take a quiet satisfaction in it that was unlike anything I had seen in him before. He sat a little straighter on that stool. He took a little longer with his pie. Once, about 8 months in, I asked him who they were. He looked at the 2 riders in the corner booth, and then he looked back at me and he said, "Friends of mine." He said it the way a man says something that is both the simple truth and the whole story at once. Earl passed in March of the following year, at home in his own bed in the early morning. His son came out from Oregon, and there was a small service at the Baptist church on the far side of town. Not many people from the world outside had known Earl well enough to mark his going. But on the morning of the service, the county road outside that church was lined from the gravel lot to the far curve of the hill with motorcycles. 97 of them, parked 2 deep in the same orderly way they had filled Hatchett's lot that October afternoon. The riders stood along the road with their hands folded in front of them while the service was conducted inside. They did not come in. They did not need to. They were simply present, and their presence said something that no eulogy has the grammar for. Earl's son stood on the church steps afterward, looking out at that road for a long moment. I was there. I had closed the diner for the morning. The first time in 11 years I had done that on a Thursday. I saw the son's face. He was a man who had, I think, arrived at that service with a certain weight of distance and regret that had been building in him for some years. What he saw on that road did something to that weight. I cannot tell you exactly what it did, but he stood there for a long time, and he was very quiet. The riders mounted up and left the way they had come, in that same 2x2 column down the county road, and the sound of them built and then faded until the road was ordinary again. People ask me why I stay. I stay because I was standing at that counter the day a big man in a leather vest set a hat back on an old soldier's head like it was the most natural thing in the world, and walked him out to his truck and stood in the October light and held his hand until there was nothing more to say. I stay because I was there the Thursday it started and the March morning it ended, and I want to be close to the memory of it, the way you want to be close to a window that faces the right direction. I stay because I know now that the men who look like the danger are sometimes the ones who ride 200 miles to stand in the cold outside a small church and say goodbye to a man most of the world forgot. And because Earl sat a little straighter on that stool in the last 2 years of his life, and some of that was because of a corner booth and a cup of coffee and 97 motorcycles on a Thursday afternoon. That is why I stay.